Concluding our unit on the religions of Asia, today I'm going to discuss Daoism and Confucianism. The philosophical systems of Daoism and Confucianism develop out of ancient Chinese rituals and beliefs concerning the preservation of the natural order of things in a similar way to the notion that the fire rituals of the Vedas preserved the orbit of the sun around the earth and the flow of the seasons, the coming of the rains and summer and winter. Early Chinese worshipped plants, animals, rivers, mountains, personified as deities, made animal sacrifices to ancestors, as well as to gods of the elements, earth, wind, and fire. The king in ancient China was the only one who could worship the gods of the soil, and he could succeed in, it was believed that he was the only one who could succeed in calming the powerful gods of the mountains and the rivers who were responsible for natural disasters. So it was the responsibility of kings to perform divination rituals, or rituals like throwing a bunch of sticks on the ground, reading the patterns in which the sticks fell so that they could divine the intentions of the gods and even tell the future. It was thought this is actually the basis of the practice of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which is itself a common source for both Taoism and Confucianism. Taoism and Confucianism both emerged in the 6th century as new codified systems of religious and political knowledge, which placed greater emphasis on individual morality and on the importance of two learned teachers, Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, and Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. Taoism and Confucianism both draw from classical Chinese thought, analogical reasoning, or reasoning about the way the world is based on perceived analogies and similarities between things. So take an example of this kind of reasoning from medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, it was widely believed that there were 7 celestial bodies orbiting around the Earth, that there could only be 7 planets, actually, that there could be no more than this because there are 7 apertures or openings on the human head: the mouth, the 2 nostrils, the 2 eyes, and the 2 ear holes. And it was reasoned that since God created everything in perfect parity or perfect symmetry, that there could be no more than 7 celestial bodies orbiting around the earth, because there are only 7 apertures in the human head. We talked about a little bit in class before about the humorial theory of the body, the belief that the body is made up of these 4 gross elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and that if the humors of the body get out of balance, then you have to eat food or take medicine to rebalance them. So it was believed that some foods have hot, dry, wet, and cold properties, and that you need to eat the right amount of these in order to restore balance in the body. If you have too much bilious humor or too much gas humor, well, you can reduce this by draining blood, right? So this is how George Washington dies, because the people still believed in the humorial theory of the body even in the 18th century. So this is reasoning on the basis of analogical reasoning. We look out in the world, and what does the world look like it's made out of? It looks like it's made out of earth, water, air, and fire. So sure, why not? These must be the gross elements of matter and the foundations for the humors of the body. This is pre-modern medical science everywhere. In ancient Chinese thought, used reasoning by analogy, analogical reasoning, to conclude that any action will eventually produce a balancing reaction. What goes up must come down. And this is the basis for the yin and the yang, the metaphysics of Taoism. People observe that there's a tendency for natural processes to tend towards balance. So this is the origin of the yin and the yang. So we have life and death, summer and winter, momentum and inertia. These are all examples of balance in nature, or yin and yang. There was a belief that by understanding the natural order of things, the Tao, we understand not just the natural world, but also the natural order of things as a means of informing moral and political decision making. This is really the basis for Taoism. Taoism takes this kind of metaphysical reasoning about the way that nature works to extend it to normative claims about the way that human political life should work. Now, that's Taoism. Confucianism. So Confucianism is not Taoism. They emerged at the same time in China. They're different schools of thought. Confucianism is really a kind of political philosophy. Confucius also spoke of the Tao, or the way, which for him meant not something mystical or metaphysical like it does for Taoists, but the way, the Tao of social righteousness. There's a conservative strain to both Taoism and Confucianism, and a tendency in both systems to support social hierarchy. Confucius does so in as much as he accepts the natural human tendency towards acquisition and the consequent tendency for some people to acquire more than others. So Confucius is really okay with social inequality. He thinks that this is part of human nature, uh, to want to acquire things, and for some people to be more talented than others, and for some people to acquire more than others. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, is more of a redistributionist. He's more of kind of a socialist politically, but he's a conservative insofar as he accepts that monarchy and the institutions of feudal hierarchy are necessary for governance in accord with the Tao. So he's definitely, he doesn't believe in democracy. He thinks that the feudal system of pre-modern China is the way to do it, essentially the way to for society to be in accordance with the natural order of things. A historicist reading of Confucius and Lao Tzu would probably interpret their affection for authority as a consequence of the fact that they lived in very unstable times politically, and there was a nostalgia for the earlier empires of the early first millennium BCE, which controlled most of modern China, which were very strong, which were regarded as great centers of accomplishment both politically and culturally. Like India, China lays claim to a millennia old civilizational history. Agricultural settlements on the Yellow River Valley date to as early as 2000 BCE. By the end of by this time, by the end of the Stone Age, the end of the Neolithic period, people in small communities in China were burying the bones of deceased family members in the corners of their cottages. Bones were buried under the place where seeds were stored, like rice seeds and barley seeds. And when the seeds sometimes mysteriously germinated, people believed that the souls of the dead people that were buried there were active in that corner of the house. And it was believed that each family had a certain number of souls which could disincarnate, so that is, be detached from their body when the person dies, and then reincarnate over and over again, and that the souls were bound to the members of the family, the members of the household from which they had originated. So this is the foundational premise of ancestor worship. Ancestor worship, which goes way back, 4,000 years old, is still practiced in China. It's a very important part of Chinese culture. Now in the 21st century, you can create a digital online shrine for a deceased loved one. Websites provide fully customizable virtual shrines. You can program the sound of crows calling to signal that the family is thinking of grandma or grandpa. You can add butterflies and flowers to make annual gifts to grandma or grandpa's shrine. And you can even have a digital little grandson to come once a day in this online simulation and light a candle to grandma or grandpa. In the ancient feudal system, it was believed that anyone who had a temple where they were allowed to keep the tablets with the names of their ancestors on them would allow them to contain all of the souls of the departed male ancestors of the family physically within that temple. So you have this kind of bank of spirits of male members of your family that could pass on from generation to generation. And this was a kind of bargaining chip that kings had over their retainers or over their feudal lords to say, hey, if you want to continue to have a lineage within your own family in the future, you better fight alongside me or I'll go and destroy your temple. I'll destroy all the names on the tablets and you won't have any ancestors anymore. And this will be the end of your family line, basically. This was the world that Confucius was born into. Confucius believed that the magical and dogmatic aspects to this system of ancestor worship were magical and nonsensical. He believed that obedience to authority, tradition, and ritual were important, but didn't believe that this was the case for the same supernatural reasons that others did. That is, he didn't believe that there is some sort of finite number of souls that you have to preserve to keep the lineage of your family going. Confucius based his vision of social order on family order. Like the son who must respect his father, the father must respect his boss, his employer, who must respect the minister to the king, who must respect the king, the father of the nation, who himself respects heaven, Tian. And reciprocally, everyone within the system has duty to those below them on the social ladder. Confucius prescribes all kinds of social relationships. That is the way that we should interact with one another, our social superiors and subordinates, in terms of politeness, ceremonies, etiquette, and matters of respect. Confucius's job was something like the closest equivalent that we have now is he was like a professor of business. He was a ru, which was someone who was employed by the office of a feudal king to serve as a coordinator at public ritual occasions and also to teach lower level government services. Confucius was one of the most influential of such people during his time, the ru. He had an enormous number of students, 3,000 allegedly. And the basic message of Confucius's teaching was to say that respect for elders, also respect for ancestors, is an essential building block of civil society. The whole system of a functioning civil society begins with what Confucius calls filial piety, respect for elders and social superiors. In fulfilling this form of social duty, filial piety, we have to respect elders when we're young, care for them when they're old, mourn them when they die, and maintain their shrines and offerings once they're deceased. Confucius's bottom-up understanding of a correctly functioning society, this is not unlike the varnashrama dharma system in Hinduism, where you have social castes, each depending on the other to fulfill their duties to allow society as a whole to function together. For Confucius, these duties are hierarchical. So the duty of the menial class, the service class, producers and menial laborers are subordinate to the retailers and professionals, who are themselves subordinate to the bureaucrats and advertisers, who are in turn subordinate to the feudal lords. Society is, on Confucius's view, like a house of cards. Everyone needs to fulfill their role for the entire system to function properly. Respect within a system of hierarchy is essential for society to function. Confucius admonishes social subordinates to listen to their bosses. The virtue of a gentleman is like the wind. The virtue of the small man is like the grass. Let the blow over the grass, such that it is sure to bend. Of course, this isn't to say that you are stuck at an entry-level job for your entire life. You accumulate respect and responsibility by proving yourself first. As you are gradually promoted, you are free, and with it a great level of responsibility. The idea of ritualized relationships between social superiors and social subordinates isn't purely a matter of formality. There is, Confucius says, an indispensable component of mutual recognition of the shared humanity between any two people within society. The Chinese word here is ruan, often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or human-heartedness. The logogram for ruan is a man on the left, the number 2 on the right, signifying the relationship between two human beings. For Confucius, Ruan is an attitude that, for Confucius, Ruan is a basic feature of human psychology that we all bring to the performance of our ritual interactions within the social system. And the important thing for Confucius is that unless these ritual interactions of subordinates and superiors is motivated by some genuine human concern, some genuine concern for the person that you're talking to or interacting with you, it will be only formal and empty ritual. If you don't care about the significance of your job, the significance of your interactions with others, then merely fulfilling the formal requirements of your job and the mere performance of your duties will be insufficient. Ruan is empathy not just in the sense of feeling for others, but of understanding that by wishing others well and by being positively invested in their success, society as a whole will flourish. Confucius says that the method of human-heartedness, Ruan, is the desire to advance others to the degree that you advance yourself. Confucius and his students ask how it is that we understand what it is to be moral in the first place. Is it a mere matter of what psychologists now call operant conditioning, or being trained from a young age how to be nice to people, how to share your toys in preschool or share your snacks? I mean, you can teach pigeons how to play ping pong if you give them a little snack reward every time they knock the ball back to each other, right? So pigeons don't actually care about ping pong, they just care about the snack. Do we, Confucius asks, as people going to school, only care about the rewards that we're given for being nice to our classmates when we're young? Is morality merely a matter of training and this kind of conditioning? And Confucius' answer is no, that it's not, that we all have some inborn, well, this capacity for empathy with others, for putting ourselves in the shoes of others, and that an essential component of civic education is to kindle and enhance that basic human-heartedness that we are all born with from the beginning. Confucius's best student and the man who would become the most famous commentator on Confucius's writing was Mencius. Mencius was left after Confucius's death to defend his teacher's writing against his most severe critics. And the main schools with whom Mencius had to contend were those of the utopian school called the Maoists, who believed basically that it was possible to care equally for everyone within your society as you would for someone who was a blood relative, a blood member of your family. This was the teaching of Confucius's contemporary Mao, who believed that it was possible to have a perfect society, a society in which everyone was perfectly cared for and contented, if everyone extended the same sort of love that they had for members of their own family to everyone else. This is something that Mencius says is an impossibility. Mencius and Confucius take the family as a basic social fact, a hardwired component of our own psychology, which is not going to change. The family includes the necessity of younger generations respecting older generations. And it's from this basic social fact that Confucius and Mencius want to derive a broader social system, a social system based on filial piety, on recognizing the necessary nature of socially subordinate and superior relationships, but a society that is nonetheless fair, equitable, and not harmful. On the opposite end of the spectrum was the school of Yangtze, whom we would now identify as an absolute libertarian, someone in line with the philosophy of Ayn Rand, who believed in what she called the virtue of selfishness. Rand herself could just as easily have said what Yangtze did when he insisted that he would not give a single hair from his own head to save the whole of humanity. He believes that total self-interest maximizes efficiency and that economic efficiency is the best way to keep society running. Mencius, here on behalf of Confucius, objecting to Yangtze, replies that Yangtze is acting as if the government isn't there. But in fact, government is here. It does regulate. It does try to enable institutions to make people's lives better. Mencius points out that while Mao denies the social fact of family, Yangtze denies politics and government. Both of the two teachers, both of Confucius's two critics, are imagining their own utopian fantasies, each in their own way, while ignoring the given social realities of the necessity of family and the necessity of government. It is, Mencius argues, a natural tendency for some people to try to acquire more power than others, and it's the responsibility of government as a system of working out a way to regulate that difference. Of course, some people are going to get more than others, but we still have to be able to work out a way in which commerce can happen fairly and not all the wealth ends up in the hands of just a small group of individuals. Rather than indulging in the fantasy of a government-less society, civic duty consists in trying to make government function well and in the interest of everyone. While some aspects of Confucius's philosophy might seem classist or absolutist to us, it's interesting that Confucius was embraced by some European thinkers from the 17th century onwards for his attempt to derive a rational basis for a universal and humanistic ethical system. Confucius stands next to Augustus Caesar on the frieze of the United States Supreme Court briefing room. Ben Franklin referred to Confucius as the patron saint of the Enlightenment and likened his own attempt to restore the Chinese monarchy of his day to the American revolutionaries' effort to restore the colonies of the Americas to the status of a great republic of our classical Greek and Roman civilizations. Whereas Confucius' system is built primarily upon observations of human nature, Daoism builds upon observations of the natural world in general. For millennia in China, there existed a belief that the cosmos is a manifestation of an impersonal, self-generating, physical spiritual substance, which is called qi. It is basically the stuff out of which all things are composed. Qi has two aspects, yin and yang, which are responsible for the movement and flow of the observable world around us. Yin is the dark, receptive female aspect of qi, and yang is the bright, assertive male aspect. Yin and yang are attracted to one another and interpenetrate one another. Once one, yin or yang, reaches a level of maximal saturation by the other, the attractive force alternates to a repulsive force, and balance is restored. Life and death, summer and winter, momentum and inertia are all examples of the activities of yin and yang. Lao Tzu's collection of the wisdom of the Tao, the Tao Te Ching, is one of the most translated titles in the world. A friend of mine at the University of Chicago wrote his PhD dissertation on translations of the Tao Te Ching, and he counted something like 430 total translations in the US alone. Most of them are in English, but one was in Klingon, actually. So not only is the Tao Te Ching translated into all the real languages of the world, it's also translated into Klingon, a made-up language from Star Trek. According to the Chinese chronicles, Lao Tzu was an elder contemporary of Confucius, said to have been miraculously conceived, like Jesus and the Buddha, his mother impregnated by a shooting star. He's said to have been in his mother's belly for 82 years before he was born. So that makes Siddhartha's pregnancy of 10 months look amateur. Lao Tzu means old boy, referring to the legend that when he was born, he already had a white beard, like a wise old man. Lao Tzu was a historian in charge of the archives of the Kingdom of Chu, an ancient state in southeast China, and unlike Confucius, didn't live a public life of a college professor and administrator of the court, but rather had a private, secluded life as the historian in charge of the archives of Chu. Lao Tzu's biography depicts him at the age of 160, fleeing through the gates of China, so at the very limits of the kingdom. And when he reached the checkpoint or border crossing into the western region, he was asked to write a book by the guard there. The Tao Te Ching is, according to this legend, the product of that request. So it is Lao Tzu's distilled knowledge as a wise 160-year-old man, a man who devoted his life to philosophy, which he passed on in this very concise form. The Tao Te Ching is a short, pithy book. It's really just a series of aphorisms collected together, leaving a great deal up to the reader's interpretation. There are many possible translations of the book's title. Roughly translated, it means something like the classic work on the Tao, the way, and on the power or virtue that the Tao contains or speaks of. So what does the Tao refer to? What is this Tao that we're supposed to follow? According to Lao Tzu, it refers to the fundamental order of nature, the way of things as laid out in heaven and earth from the beginning of time. Flowing or effortless action is the key to understanding the way of the Tao. Lao Tzu's recommendation for getting in tune with the Tao is stillness. To the mind that is still, he says, the whole universe surrenders. We need to let go of our schedules, worries, and complex thoughts for a while and simply experience the world around us. We spend so much time rushing from place to place. Lao Tzu reminds us that nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. Not only was Rome not built in a day, but the Grand Canyon took millions of years to erode through nature to become such a spectacular wonder of nature. Like the changing of leaves in the autumn or the growing and blossoming of flowers, certain things only happen at their own pace. We can't rush them. Just as this is true in the natural world, it's true for human life as well. We can't rush grieving, growing wiser as we get old, developing new relationships with people whom we've met. Just as the usefulness of a pot comes from its emptiness, Lao Tzu admonishes us to empty ourselves of everything and let our minds become still. If you're too busy, too preoccupied with anxiety or ambition, you'll miss the 1,000 moments of human experience that are our natural inheritance. We need to be awake to the sounds of the birds in the morning, the way that people look when they're laughing, the feeling of a wind against our face. We spend a great deal of time worrying about who we ought to become, should be taking the time to discover who we really are at heart. We might rediscover a generous impulse, a playful side, or simply an old affection for long walks. Our ego is often in the way of our true self. Our true self can only be found by being receptive to the outside world, rather than focusing on some critical, too ambitious, internal image. When I let go of who I am, Lao Tzu says, I become what I might be. Nature is particularly useful for helping us to find ourselves. Lao Tzu liked to compare different parts of nature to different virtues, he said. The best people are like water, which benefits all things and does not compete with them. It stays in lowly places which others reject, which is why it is so similar to the Tao. Each part of nature can remind us of a human quality we admire, the strength of the mountains, the resilience of trees, the cheerfulness of flowers. For Confucius, human nature is fundamentally good, We just have to make sure that we receive moral instruction at a young age to make sure our good nature, our rules shines through. For Lao Tzu, human nature, primarily the human ego, is a diluting factor that prevents one from seeing nature in its true state. Our natural tendencies of desire and covetousness are contrary to the Tao and therefore must be curbed. The Taoist notion of equilibrium is basically just what goes up must come down. And so the unbridled quest for wealth and power will eventually end in disaster and personal misfortune, according to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu admonishes the reader in a Buddhist fashion to know contentment and to know when to stop. The last portion of this verse could just as easily be something in any Buddhist text we find when Lao Tzu says that there is no crime greater than having too many desires. There is no disaster greater than not being content. There is no misfortune greater than being covetous. Here we remember the Buddhist concept of tanha, the second noble truth. It is craving that gives rise to dissatisfaction and dukkha. Lao Tzu here offers his readers similar advice. The Tao Te Ching, written during a time of political instability and warring states in China, can largely be interpreted as a treatise on government. The text enjoins that a ruler, himself or her life, be like the Tao. Lao Tzu forewarns the danger of a popular revolt if a king should become too oppressive. When people are not afraid of death, how can one frighten them with death? We learn that there is an active element to the Tao, ensuring balance in the world. Is not the way of heaven like the stretching of a bow? The high it presses down, the low it lifts up, the excessive it takes from the deficient it gives to. It is the way of heaven, Tian, to take from what has in excess in order to make good what is deficient. This verse describes the Tao as like kind of cosmic Robin Hood, taking from the rich to give to the poor. According to Lao Tzu, it's a ruler's job to facilitate this kind of redistribution. While Confucianism works from a bottom-up theory of social organization, Taoism takes a more top-down approach. Lao Tzu explains that when a ruler conducts himself or herself in accordance with the Tao, the rest of society naturally conforms. If princes and kings were able to maintain it, all things would of themselves be transformed by them. Here there are a number of parallels between Zen Buddhism and Taoism, and parallels with the concept of the Tao with Mahayana Buddhist notions of Buddha nature and the natural way of Dharma, an insistence on emptiness, shunyata, the absence of any ego, aligning oneself on the path of eventual realization of enlightenment. It's unsurprising then that when Buddhists reached China several hundred years after Lao Tzu, there were all kinds of fantastical stories about the Buddha having made some sort of secret trip to China, teaching to Lao Tzu, making Lao Tzu out to be a kind of crypto-Buddhist. And conversely, students and followers of Lao Tzu making the opposite claim, saying that Lao Tzu had traveled to India and taught the Buddha, and that Buddhism was really just the Indianized version of Taoism. None of this is essential to answering the homework question for today, but for those of you who are perhaps thinking about writing a paper comparing Buddhism to Taoism, you see that there's a fair amount of material to work with here.